and back to the 56th public lecture series celebrating 30 years of research at the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus. I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our tonight's speaker, Dr. Florian Schimpf, a postdoctoral researcher at the ARU since last year. Florian obtained his master's degree in classical archaeology and history at the University of Frankfurt and the Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University in Istanbul in 2013. Dr. Schimpf continued with his doctoral research at the University of Mainz, where he defended in 2017 his PhD thesis entitled Natural Sanctuaries in Western Asia Minor, Sacred Nature from Archaic to Late Hellenistic Times. In September 2020, he left Germany to come to Cyprus, having won a 2-year Onisiolos postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Cyprus for the research project Hamasos, coordinated by our colleague Dr. George Papasavvas. His research interests include the archaeology and history of Cyprus in the first millennium BC, topography and architecture, sanctuaries, and cult practices. Before moving to Cyprus, Florian was assistant lecturer at the Institute for Archaeological Sciences of the University of Frankfurt between 2018 and 2020, and lecturer at the Rhine-Main University of Applied Sciences in 2019 to 2020. Dr. Schimpf has won several grants for his MA and PhD studies, such as the Ernst Kirsten Gesellschaft in 2013, the Mediterranean Award of the University of Frankfurt in 2014, and the Philipp Haupt and Gisela Spinnemann Foundation Award in 2017. He's an active field archaeologist, having participated in numerous excavation projects since his postgraduate years, such as Xanten in Germany, Mirobriga in Portugal, Ulpiana in Kosovo, and Praini in Turkey. He has also been active in presenting the results of his work at conferences since 2011 in edited volumes published with Archaeopress, as well as in journals and conference proceedings volumes. Florian's lecture today relates to his ongoing postdoctoral program, and it is entitled Hamasos, Results of the City Excavation 1970 to 1921. Before Florian's presentation, I would like to remind you to switch off your cameras and mute your microphones. Should you wish to address a question or comment to our speaker, feel free to use the chat button on Zoom. You may also switch on your cameras after the end of the presentation to address your question directly to the speaker by raising your hand and unmuting your microphone. Florian, good evening and welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay.
You may share your screen. Yeah.
You should see my screen by now, and until then, thank you, Professor Vionis, for this kind introduction, and again, good evening to everyone. As we move forward in time, that is both in this very lecture series as well as in the historical periods addressed, we shall now enter a millennium characterized by the rise and fall of city kingdoms. Their local claims, as well as their dealings with mainland empires, provide the historical, albeit scanty frame in which the archaeological evidence is to be discussed and interpreted. Hamasos once was one of these kingdoms of Iron Age Cyprus, and in the dawn of this new age, it was supposed to bring in the eponymous metal, at least that's what you can read into the dialogue of Athena and Telemachos in the very beginning of the Odyssey. Frankly, I am in no position to discuss the identity of Temese and its association with Hamasos, nor the exchange of iron for copper or questions concerning metal processing. What I can provide, however, are insights into the city in question. That is, a morphological survey of the architectural remains excavated in the 1970s. Together with the neighboring polities of Idalion, that's modern Dali to its east, and Letra, of course modern Nicosia to its north, Hamasos is located in the fertile plain of the Messaoria, some 21 kilometers southwest of Nicosia at the modern villages of Politico and Pera. This locality may be considered decisive in terms of building activity and building materials used, while the adjacent river Pediaios supplied with building material characterizing the site's today's appearance. The exploitation of the copper sulfate deposits at the nearby foothills of the Troodos set the stage for economic welfare, hence rich building activity from the Cypro-Archaic period onward. It is the famous stele Sargon II of Assyria set up at Kition that testifies rulership as early as in the late 8th century BC. Unfortunately, he does not identify their respective kingdoms by name, of which 7 brought before him in Babylon precious goods. The unnamed kingdoms would not stay anonymous much longer, but their names be revealed in yet another invaluable inscription. On the prism of Esarhaddon, Hamasos is listed along with 9 other capital centers and their respective sovereigns, the names of which are not important for us now. However glorious the earlier days of Hamasos might have been when listed among the capital centers of Cyprus and even praised by Homer, it never gained sufficient glorification in the aftermath. The former kingdom has failed to provide a retrospective foundation legend, as have the other 2 inland centers, Idalion and Letra. I'm in no position to judge on the other 2 polities, but speaking of Hamasos, this lack of textual commemoration might be considered indicative of a descending importance in the classical and Hellenistic periods. What's even more revealing is that Hamasos did not provide any coins, and we do not know of any kings from the 5th century BC. This lack of literary, inscriptional, and numismatic evidence is significant, all indicating that Hamasos eventually lost its autonomous status already in the 5th century BC. However, the former kingdom did not cease to be, but continued to be an important inland center. Later on, an episode from Alexander's campaign mentioned by Athenios deals with the endowment of a former kingdom, which had been sold to Pygmalion, king of Kition, and is now to be given to Pythagoras of Salamis. The city in question is commonly associated with Hamasos, since Pumayaton of Kition called himself king of Idalion and Hamasos in 341 BC, but did no longer refer to Hamasos in 325 BC. Thus, Hamasos remained an important inland center claimed by Kition and Salamis, and in one way or another continued to be one in the aftermath of Alexander's death, becoming part of the Ptolemaic Empire at the end of the 4th century BC, a bishop's seat in Christian times, and an excavation site in 1889. When Max Ohnefalsch Richter concentrated his quest for antiquities on central Cyprus, and amongst other burials, unearthed the famous royal tombs and the necropolis of the Cypro-Archaic periods associated with them. Before he started excavating the impressive tombs, he was examining the topographic surroundings. Having been brought to his attention by locals, he uncovered the rural sanctuary of Apollo at Frangissa in 1885. The site to which he referred to as one of the most important find spots on the entire island was filled in again after the excavation, and its location was forgotten for a long time until Matthias Streike succeeded to determine it last year. This year's results prove that renewed investigations promise invaluable insights into the dedication practice and the internal structure of that rural shrine. Another extra-urban sanctuary dedicated to Apollo in the riverbed of the Pediaios was examined in 1889 and likewise lost in the aftermath. It is the spot where the famous Chatfish head, or more precisely a larger than life-size bronze statue, had been discovered in 1836 and soon after broken by its finders. With the exception of the head, which is now in the possession of the British Museum. The find spot in the bed of the Pediaios has recently been determined by Recke and Kai Jürgens. However, as Untitled Chapter before them, they too did not observe any traces of architecture. What remains are the report of Untitled Chapter and the finds made in 1889. Among them, the larger than life-size charioteer on display in the garden of the Cyprus Museum, studied by Jürgen for his master thesis. Finally, Untitled Chapter unearthed several necropolis with hundreds of tombs and their contents. Among them, the famous royal tombs in 1889, just outside the city wall of Hamasos, that have been studied by Katja Walscher and continue to be studied by Hartmut Matthäus. The results of Untitled Chapter's activities, including the ones of his work at Edalion, were supposed to be published, but despite several announcements, never have been. In order to publish Untitled Chapter's manuscript properly, especially the tombs that had been discovered at Hamasos, further research was required and finally initiated by Hans-Günter Buchholz in 1970. This undertaking soon turned into a decade of systematic fieldwork supported by the German Archaeological Institute and followed by many more work-up campaigns, which led to the exposure of the nearby city associated with the tombs and addressed in this lecture. Until 2010, significant findings, various assemblages, as well as comprehensive studies on the royal tombs and the city's necropolis had been published. Then, in 2011, Hans-Günter Buchholz, the head of the German mission to Hamasos, passed. Following his death, the project of publishing the results successively faltered. Although further volumes on the royal tombs of Hamasos by Hartmut Matthäus and on the extra-urban sanctuaries with a focus on the sanctuary of Apollo at Frangisa by Matthias Recke are planned, the final publication of the city excavation remained pending. However, shortly before his death, Buchholz entrusted the entire documentation, consisting of the written record, several thousand photographies of the excavation site and the findings, drawings and plans, all digitized in the course of the last year, to Matthäus and Recke. In 2019, they offered me the opportunity to study Buchholz's records on the city excavation with the goal to provide a comprehensive morphological analysis of the material evidence and to present the development of the site, the function of its various buildings, and the publication of the hitherto unknown material, the results of which will hopefully contribute to our all too scarce knowledge of 5th and 4th centuries BC architecture and to our understanding of its conception and perception within an urban environment. Having been granted the Onesilos Fellowship by the University of Cyprus, I came here in late summer 2020 and began working on the material evidence and the functional and structuralist interpretation of it. When I visited Hamasos first in spring 2019, I was, well, let's call it overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed by the tombs accessible on the one side and by a peculiar accumulation of cobble on the other side. I understood that foundation walls are either made of river stones from the adjacent Pediaios River or cobbled together with unprocessed limestone, and that only few sections exceed floor level. Such extensive use of river stone as building material is not restricted to an historic period, but to inland sites or sites close to the river Pediaios respectively, and even defines the character of the city's successor, Pera. On that day in 2019, I held onto something familiar, and I want to turn this structure into our starting point this evening. an outstanding edifice made of processed ashlar masonry. The edifice I'd like to begin with is located south of the royal tombs, which are, I hope you can see the cursor, are here to the north. It was unearthed in the very first excavation campaign because another grave had presumably been cut during landscaping. And after all, the initial goal was to review and to systematically examine the burials that had been discovered in 1889 by Untitled Chapter. Work had already begun on the other side of a modern road, which you can see in the middle. That's the blank spot. That's the modern road. Work had already begun on that side, on that other side of the modern road, and an impressive structure that turned out to be the city wall had been uncovered. In retrospect, one cannot be surprised that limestone slabs, which had soon been discovered, did not conceal another burial, but an interurban edifice that gave occasion to an extension of the excavation site on that very side of the road. The northern portions of the building unit in question, soon after its discovery referred to as a courtyard, is surrounded by an approximately 0.5 meter deep foundation wall made of river stone and unprocessed limestone fixed in clay, of which only the western and the northern sections remain. Just to be clear, I'm speaking of this area, which you can see on the photos in the front, surrounded, bordered by a foundation wall made of river stones and limestone. The northern enclosure, which is in the front of the pictures, and here, the northern enclosure measures 4.7 meters west-east, but presumably continued further east. Its length cannot be determined with certainty as the rear portions have been destroyed. These foundations carried a superstructure made of straw-tempered mud bricks, scattered remains of which were found alongside the enclosure. The lowermost bricks had to be sheltered from moisture. Such protection was achieved either by covering slabs, by pedestals, or by superimposed layers of the foundation wall, which is the case in the courtyard. In the western part of the courtyard, a well-preserved plaster floor on a layer of small stones was unearthed. You can see this layer of small stones on the right. On top of it, on top of this flooring, scattered remains of wall plaster were recovered, which you can see, as I said, I hope you can see the cursor, which you can see over here at the margin of the courtyard. Plaster was recovered, wall plaster was recovered. The plaster shows a smooth surface and contains an aggregate of sand or pebble to increase its strength and hardness. Whether the bonding material was gypsum or lime remains uncertain, since observations are of appearances only, and fragments have merely been described in sense of color and tempering additions. Now, as you can see on the shadow cast by the uppermost river stones, here on the left, here, this flooring is not level with the foundation. In order to protect the mud brick elevation from moisture, the foundation's top layer is remarkably higher than the adjoining floor level. To the south, the western enclosure is followed by a room 1 meter and 85 in length, with a flooring and a pedestal made of carefully processed limestone slabs. This finely dressed pedestal forms a seating for a presumably mud brick superstructure of unknown height. And it is made of a double-faced shell of raised limestone slabs, tuck-pointed with small gravel and limestone chips in gypsum mortar. It rests on a layer of recumbent blocks lining the foundation made of river stones. On top of the upright orthostats, slabs were laid down as a leveling course. The orthostatic elevation just shown, as well as the river stone foundation beneath it, continue further south, where they define a second room with an indurated clay floor measuring 2.5 meters north-south. This second room is this one over here. Here, it is the width that cannot be determined with certainty, as the edifice rear portions have been obscured by later alterations. Albeit dated to the end of the 13th century BC, it is Temple 1 at Kition that provides strong, yet elaborate and monumental parallels. The inner faces of which constitute of a leveling course made of recumbent blocks carrying a superstructure of raised hairline jointing ashlars with face panels measuring up to 3 meters in length and 1 meter in height. The outer faces were made of large stones of irregular shape, revetting an inner filling of rubble, but were rebuilt with superimposed ashlar blocks in the second half of the 9th century BC. However, we have to bear in mind that maybe the orthostatic skeleton at Hamasos was not a meaningful way for lining the foundation walls, but simply used to prevent the mud brick superstructure from moisture erosion. All the more if you consider the orthostatic socle covered with plaster. Remains of such were observed, and one sample taken and analyzed showed that it is gypsum plaster. Anyhow, the edifice at Hamasos does recall the late Cypriot Temple 1 and the Phoenician Temple respectively in regard to its function, which proved to be a cultic one after a cubic altar made of rustic limestone slabs was unearthed immediately north of the courtyard. In addition, both outside and inside the court, alongside the northern enclosure, deposits comprising a significant amount of dishes, bowls, and lamps were found. Among those were ceramic fragments which carry an incised alpha and molded terracotta figurines, commonly called Astarte plaques, showing the goddess with an oblong face and curved hairstyle, wearing earrings, all in all attesting to ritual activity and indicating the compound's assignment to the Cypriot goddess. Apart from insights into the dedication practice, these deposits, to whom we will return in just a minute, yield valuable information regarding the spatial structuring of the sanctuary. They extend to the west of the courtyard, suggesting an outer altar compound surrounding an inner temple precinct. Regarding the edifice at the rear of the inner court, scattered yet aligning portions of foundation walls came to light during follow-up investigations beneath the road mentioned earlier, which could only be removed in 1979 after the construction of a bypass road. Unfortunately, this section is severely disturbed. However, the layout and plan of the architectural remains suggest a complex consisting of a wide-fronted porch and a wide-fronted cellar placed at the rear of two courts. In order to understand both the layering and the labeling of the overall complex, the systems developed by Kierstad on behalf of Cypriot sanctuaries examined by the Swedish Cyprus expedition and by Bright on behalf of Bronze Age edifices in the Levant remain the most comprehensive approaches to Cypriot architecture and the arrangement of the sacred space. Bright's building types are defined and categorized in terms of rooms and axiality. They are classified according to the position of entrances rather than in terms of form and plan. His first type comprises unroofed structures or open courts, thus the simplest type of building. The others being distinguished by the disposition of the entrance and the directional axis. It is the broad room type, where entrance to an oblong room is in the middle of a long side that resembles the design of the edifice at Hamasos. The Levant provides strong yet elaborate parallels, one being the temple of the weather god on the citadel of Aleppo, which dates back to the Middle Bronze Age, but whose almost square ground plan was with a so-called Breitraum cellar, and an axially situated entrance remained more or less the same throughout the late Bronze and down into the early Iron Age. Nara is assigned to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods. It is situated at the northwestern edge of the Acropolis and opens onto a wide and paved courtyard in the southeast. In Kierstad's well-known classification, it is this manner of overall layout and layering that characterizes and distinguishes the type of sanctuary. His 5 types of sanctuary are defined by first, a temenos with an unroofed court and with an altar as its sacred center. Second, a detached chapel not connected with a temenos court. Third, a combination of temenos and chapel consisting of an exterior court, an inner court, and a chapel which does not form an architectural unit with the inner court, though it may be attached to it. And fourth, 1 or 2 courts, usually rectangular and regularly shaped, and a temple placed at the margin of the innermost court, so that the chapel and the court do form an architectural unit. His last type of sanctuary recalls the Greek system. Hence, a layering of sacred space achieved by 1 or 2 courts along with a temple placed at the inner court's margin fits the definition of this 4th type of sanctuary. Form, plan, and the disposition of the altar inside the forecourt resemble the layout of the Cyproclassical sanctuary of Athena at Vuni, the tripartite Holy of Holies of which does recall the broad room format. But what about the use phases of the sanctuary at Hamasos? The entire precinct, that is the northern enclosure as well as the building at its margin, rest on top of an older, approximately 0.4 meter deep foundation, which you can see, which I want you to see right here beneath the upper foundation wall. In contrast to the younger phase, this slightly projecting foundation wall is made of river stones only, without limestone. Thus, at least 2 building phases can be distinguished. The most recent one constituting of a pedestal made of orthostats on top of 2 subsequent foundations. Now let us return to the abundant deposits uncovered both outside and inside the courtyard, and next to it alongside its western enclosure. That is this very area. Corresponding to the building phases, 2 different strata were identified. One being rich in copper slag and casting waste, and associated with a slightly projecting older enclosure built of river stones only. The other one being rich in ceramics and associated with a younger enclosure made of river stones together with unprocessed limestone carrying the pedestal. The two strata are distinguishable by their spectrum of fines, but furthermore separated from each other by a floor that has been preserved just outside the courtyard, the remains of which you can see right here. This floor was partially cut during the construction of the younger enclosure. The bulk of pottery found on it consists of numerous small dishes, bowls, lamps of the saucer type with flat rims pinched into narrow nozzles, and shovels. Black glazed pottery and a temple boy provide a date in the latter part of the 4th century BC. In comparison, the stratum underneath the floor yielded only few diagnostic pieces, but 2 of the aforementioned Astarte figurines assigned to late Cypro-Archaic I. We are therefore able to date the restoration to a period transitional between the Cypro-Archaic II and Cypro-Classical periods. Being found beneath floor level of the older compound, this stratum postdates the use phase of Temple I and must be associated with the very earliest building phase, indicated by the scattered remains of a wall made of river stones underneath the northern enclosure, which runs north-south but is not aligned with the western foundation wall. You can see these oldest remains underneath the courtyard. That's the area of the courtyard. These are the enclosure walls. This is the northern enclosure. You can see the scattered remains over here. And I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that this is the northern part of this wall beneath the altar and beneath the courtyard. Moreover, the constructional filling explains the disposition of the stratum outside as well as inside the later temple compounds. Regarding the construction of the walls, their bonding and their relation to a plaster flooring immediately west of the courtyard, the date of which is fixed chiefly by pottery finds above and few terracotta figurines below it, at least 3 major building phases in Cypro-Archaic and Cypro-Classical times can thus be identified. The preserved altar, stratigraphically belonging to the 2nd phase and being buried when the precinct was raised in order to rebuild the exact same layout on higher grounds. In regard to the spatial structuring of the sanctuary in its very earliest phase, of which only all 2 scattered portions remain underneath the northern enclosure and beneath the altar, the building unit west of the precinct just discussed proved revealing. Here, at the very same level, built in the very same manner, that is solely out of river stone, and linked to the very same stratum comprising of Cypro-Archaic material only, an oblong edifice oriented north-south was uncovered. Its length cannot be determined with certainty as the northern portions have been obscured by later alterations, nor can its purpose be sufficiently deciphered. Another pair of Astarte plaques and several small dishes suggest an assignment to the sanctuary, but for now, this precinct, its interior design, its function, and the very first use phase of the sanctuary remain terra incognita. When the temple compound was built in phase 2, the eastern unit of phase 1 had been destroyed. However, the western unit was raised and at least its eastern wall extended to the south. And yet another oblong edifice to its west was added. The trench, crucial for its identification and likewise its dating, was opened north of one section of fine ashlar masonry we will return to in just a minute. Here, the foundation trench of a wall running north was uncovered, on top of which fine ashlar masonry intersects. Finds made in the uppermost layer linked to the fine ashlar masonry date to the 4th century BC, whereas the stratum associated with the foundation trench contained 6th and 5th century material only. The overall shape of this structure can be gained by adjoining and aligning walls, but again, the interior design remains unknown. When the early Cyproclassical edifice was built, it didn't use the phase 1 structure as foundation, but was placed close to and aligned with its western facade, indicating that the adjoining edifice was still in place. The next and last building I want to address tonight was partially built over the structures of phase 2. In view of significant findings, the row of rooms to the southwest are most revealing. The northernmost one measures 4 meters east-west and 2.5 meters north-south. Traces of plaster floor have been found in the southeastern corner of the room, another one about 20 centimeters below. The documentation speaks of bonding walls, suggesting a concurrent construction, moreover, at the same time as the adjacent room to its south. This one, the adjacent room to its south, room number 2, measures 4 meters east-west and approximately 4.5 meters north-south. Its western as well as its northern foundation, made of river stone, rest on the bedrock. 3 different floors were uncovered inside of this room. The uppermost is made of pebbles. Underneath the stone flooring, another one made of plaster was uncovered. The findings from in between these 2 floors have been recorded statistically with remarks like, I quote, numerous fragments of classical times, but unfortunately have not been kept. However, the excavators documented several fragments from the end of Cyproclassical times underneath the 3rd flooring, postdating the used surfaces above. The southernmost room, number 3, is comparable in size to the adjacent one. Its walls are made of river stone foundations that support 1 to 2 isodome layers of rough-cut ashlar blocks. This seems to be rather residual than exceptional. Scattered remains of ashlar masonry had been found in the southern as well as in the eastern section of that building. The ashlars are of medium to coarse-grained sandy limestone. The masonry is carried out in the so-called shell wall system, meaning 2 slabs of limestone placed upright and lengthways as runners, alternating with recumbent ones placed crosswise as binders. The raised slabs form an outer revetment with a joint measuring about 0.1 meters in width and an inner filling of small stones. Here too, a plaster flooring framed with medium-sized black river stones has been observed, the depth of which matches the lowermost one in the adjacent room to the north. Furthermore, equal in depth, black glazed sherds have been found, suggesting an association of this flooring with the lowermost one in the adjacent room. So far, a row of 3 rooms has been identified, each provided with at least 2 floors. The lowermost floors of all 3 rooms have been uncovered at the very same level. Interior as well as outer walls are not only bonding, but built on the bedrock, all in all suggesting the same date of construction. The foundations are made of river stones. Only room 3 in the south preserves 2 layers of ashlar masonry carried out in the runner-binder system. Roofing tiles were found in all 3 rooms, suggesting rather pitched than plastered flat roofs. The ones kept and stored in the Cyprus Museum are made of the same fabric and comprise of both pen tiles and cover tiles of Corinthian style. The calipters display distinct ridges on the upper surface and a flange on the under surface. They are brownish in appearance, the cover tiles in contrast light buff. The aforementioned trench, let me remind you of it, this trench that revealed the western portions of an oblong edifice of phase 2, here in red, yielded another stratum linked to the intersecting ashlar masonry and corresponding to Cyproclassical 2. Although it doesn't use the oblong building as foundation, the eastern section of the large building is built over the one of phase 2, which caused a higher floor level in the eastern compartments that was gradually equalized by superimposed floors inside the west wing. Little can be said regarding the east wing's interior layout. For its northern portions, the documentation speaks of 2 floorings, the upper one made of small pebble, the lower one made of larger ones. For what it's worth, the depth of the lower floor level is corresponding to the floor of room 1, and in the western part of the building, the higher one matches precisely the second floor in room 2. Regarding the overall function of this building and the dimensions of the sanctuary, a deposit adjacent to the trench and the southern wall, yielding smashed sculpture, terracotta and vessels, is most interesting. The pit had been cut into the second floor and bordered by a limestone slab, which you can see on the left side of the picture. A limestone incense burner and the base fragment of a black glazed pottery bowl displaying an incised alpha on the underside of the substantial ring foot are indicative of the foreign assignment of this building to the sanctuary proper. I now come to the conclusions. Let me start with a morphological summary before extending the discussion of the material evidence beyond the intrinsic. As a rule, the foundation walls are either made of river stones from the adjacent Pediaios River or cobbled together with unprocessed limestone fixed in clay. There is no squared masonry below ground level as foundation, and there is no proof for the use of river stone as walling, respectively. For the most part, the foundations carried a superstructure made of straw-tempered mud bricks, the lowermost courses of which had to be sheltered from moisture, achieved by superimposed layers of the foundation wall or, inside the temple precinct, by the exceptional pedestal made of a double-faced shell of raised limestone slabs resting on a layer of recumbent blocks lining the foundation made of river stones. Apart from the orthostatic socle, fine dressed limestone was only used at the southwestern portions of the large building addressed last. The masonry is carried out in the so-called shell wall system. 2 slabs of limestone placed upright and lengthways, alternating with the recumbent ones placed crosswise. The prevalent floors are of plaster and of stones inset. The latter consists solely of small or medium-sized pebbles, in places homogeneously dark in color. The other one is of poured lime plaster, in some places laid on a compact bed of rubble. Limestone pavement has only been found inside the anteroom of the temple. Being exceptional and found in the Holy of Holies, we may consider limestone slabs a more valuable flooring material. Rather unusual than exceptional are the remains of a mud brick pavement found inside a largely dismantled structure that has been obscured by later construction that can hardly be associated with distinct architectural remains. Yet it comes from a stratum that succeeds phase 1. You can see on the right. The plaster used for floorings and for covering the walls shows a smooth surface and contains an aggregate of sand or pebble to increase its strength and hardness. Whether the bonding material was gypsum or lime remains uncertain, since observations are of appearances only and fragments have merely been described in sense of color and tempering additions. Both floor and wall display well rendered, smooth, hard, white plastered surfaces. Thus, even open air spaces such as the open courtyard north of the temple must have given the impression of a marble edifice. This brief survey of construction methods at Hamasos is but one first step in deciphering and understanding the architectural remains. Albeit characteristic, the observations on building material and technique are far from being indicative. First, all buildings are literally founded on material from the adjacent river. In the course of time, there is no shift in the preferred building material, but a continuous use of material easily available in the locality. Second, maybe the orthostatic sockel not only resembled the Bronze Age moat or early Iron Age successor of ashlar facing to a rubble-filled core, but was reminiscent of such. However, there can be no doubt that its primary use was to prevent the brick wall from moisture erosion. Given that it was covered with plaster, the skeleton, however elaborate or reminiscent it may seem dismantled today, was nothing more than a solid shelter from weathering. Finally, the shell wall, although usually placed vice versa, meaning the orthostats being placed crosswise and the recumbent blocks lengthways, is very common in the Mediterranean. The constructional features discussed may not be distinctive. However, representing something rather exceptional, something rather unusual, something reminiscent, and a good deal of local raw material, they are all the more characteristic. So far, 6 different strata were identified, ranging in time from the 7th till the 4th century BC. 3 of them, however, are linked to heavy build-up of surfaces indicated by superimposed floors inside the large building of phase 3. In the 7th century BC, when Hamasos had been ruled by a king and the necropolis at its outskirts produced first burials, the nearby sanctuary was characterized by at least one distinctive edifice, oblong in shape, the veneration of a female goddess, and close metalworking. We are in no position to know about the organization of metal processing, but the recovery of related material is significant, indicating a coexistence of industrial and ritual activity in that period. The most prolific period of the sanctuary dates to a period transitional between Cypro-Archaic II and Cypro-Classical I, which coincides with the necropolis heyday. During this period, aligning structures oblong in shape and adjoining precincts with an altar and a temple characterized the sanctuary. Although forming an architectural unit, this design would leave the altar separated from the temple precinct at its position, thus indicating a layering and deepening of sacred space that falls within Kierstadt's and Wright's categories of design or building types, either to restrict permeability or to increase the expectations. This arrangement was in place until the late 4th century BC, when it was destroyed, rebuilt on higher ground, and equipped with an orthostatic socle, and a large building was added in the west. This renewal is indicative of construction activity in the aftermath of Alexander's campaign and the Ptolemaic sovereignty, respectively. It's been 2 years since I visited the excavation site, and it took me that long to understand its spatial arrangement. I hope I gave you a rough idea of it, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Florian, for this thorough overview of the excavations from Hamasos. Well, one comment I can make is that one can easily admire the work of people like you. I mean, it's not very easy to make sense of legacy data when it comes to, going through notebooks, old photographs of excavations that have been left unpublished for so long. And I'm sure this will come up in our next week's lecture as well. So congratulations, thank you very much. And I'm sure there will be some interesting discussion and comments from our audience today related not only to the this legacy data itself, but also to its interpretation in terms of the temple's function through time, and it changes from different phases through time, from the Archaic to the Hellenistic periods. Please feel free to type in your comment or question, or switch on your camera and address your question directly to Florian. As far as I can see, we have you have congratulating comments so far. Yes, please. Yes, Norma Franklin has a question. Please unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was trying to, I'm a Middle East archaeologist. I'm not a Cypriot archaeologist. And I'm trying to make, at the moment, I'm trying to look at the connection, the real dates of the royal tombs, right, 12 and 5. And I'm looking at this great architecture that you have. And